They set ambushes, positioned artillery with deadly precision, and organized infantry units to exploit every predictable maneuver. Within hours of the Panzer advance, the perfect storm of planning, timing, and ruthless execution descended on the German armored column. Visual: black and white maps, radio intercepts, Allied command rooms, officers coordinating attacks. The first day of the operation was deceptively calm. Soldiers moved with confidence, tanks rolling steadily over mud and forest paths, commanders barking orders with unwavering authority. But beneath the surface, subtle cracks were forming: fuel shortages, delayed reinforcements, and the cumulative exhaustion of continuous combat had begun to take a toll. Even the most experienced crews felt the creeping pressure of unseen threats. Visual: soldiers resting in cramped tank interiors, checking ammunition, maps with inked annotations. Then the nightmare began. Explosions ripped through armored formations, artillery shells struck with surgical precision, and ambushes from hidden infantry units caught tank crews off guard. The elite division, trained to dominate, suddenly found itself under constant attack from every direction. What was supposed to be a swift, overwhelming advance turned into a desperate struggle to survive. Visual: tank columns under fire, smoke rising, soldiers ducking, explosions tossing debris. The psychological impact was as severe as the physical destruction. Even veteran soldiers, hardened by years of conflict, were forced to confront the terrifying reality that their division could be broken. Fear and uncertainty spread rapidly, hesitation replaced aggression, and the division's famed coordination began to falter. Decisions that once came instinctively now required careful deliberation under extreme pressure and imminent danger. Visual: faces of tank crews, sweat and grime, eyes scanning the battlefield, soldiers gripping controls. Over the next 96 hours, the Panzer Lehr Division would experience losses that were staggering for a unit of its caliber. Entire tank columns were annihilated, infantry positions overrun, and artillery placements rendered ineffective. Supply lines were cut, communication disrupted, and command chains disintegrated under the relentless barrage. Every tank lost represented not just equipment, but trained personnel, strategy, and morale. Visual: destroyed tanks smoking on fields, infantry retreating under fire, aerial views of battlefields littered with debris. Yet even amidst this chaos, moments of courage and improvisation emerged. Tank crews repaired damaged vehicles under fire, soldiers fought to hold strategic positions, and commanders improvised maneuvers to regain lost ground against overwhelming odds. These acts of heroism would later be recorded in war diaries, after-action reports, and personal testimonies, serving as a testament to human endurance even in the face of near-total destruction. Visual: soldiers repairing tanks, firing under duress, commanders coordinating amid smoke and explosions. By the end of the first day, the reality was clear. The Panzer Lehr Division, for all its training and reputation, was confronting a new kind of warfare. The Allies had combined intelligence, terrain mastery, and tactical innovation to create a situation that would test every doctrine of armored combat. The next hours would push men and machines to their absolute limits. Survival, strategy, and split-second decisions would decide the fate of the division. Visual: tactical maps showing ambush points, smoke-filled valleys, destroyed tank columns, troops regrouping. The nightmare was not only physical, it was psychological and strategic. Soldiers had to fight against fear, confusion, and the relentless pressure of a coordinated enemy. Confidence turned into doubt, aggression into caution. The division that had once instilled fear now faced its own vulnerabilities, exposed in horrifying clarity. Visual: close-ups of faces, trembling hands on controls, commanders shouting amidst chaos, tanks under fire. Yet, in the midst of destruction, courage shone through. Crews refused to surrender their positions, infantrymen held critical points, and commanders improvised to salvage the mission. These fleeting moments of heroism highlighted the complex interplay of human spirit, strategy, and mechanized warfare, illustrating that even in disaster, discipline and bravery could leave a mark. Visual: soldiers emerging from burning tanks, signaling others, exchanging fire under smoke-filled skies. The Panzer Lehr Division, a force once deemed unstoppable, is entangled in a 96-hour inferno, confronting a combination of enemy strategy, environmental challenges, and relentless pressure. The coming story is not just about tanks and firepower, it is a human story of endurance, fear, and the limits of even the most elite military forces. Narrator, slow, reflective pause. What follows over the next 96 hours is a story of strategy, courage, desperation, and catastrophe. How does a division, feared by enemies and respected by allies, survive an inferno designed to destroy it? The answer lies in the decisions, mistakes, and moments of sheer human endurance that would define the legacy of Germany's elite armored unit. Narrator, calm, informative, yet tense. To understand the catastrophic events that unfolded over those fateful 96 hours, we must first examine the context and preparation that brought Germany's elite Panzer Lehr Division to the brink of destruction. This was not a sudden collapse, but a convergence of strategic decisions, battlefield experience, logistical constraints, and the relentless pressure of a rapidly advancing Allied force. Visual: Maps of Europe, 1944, highlighting German armored divisions and strategic positions. By mid-1944, the Panzer Lehr Division was widely regarded as one of the Wehrmacht's finest armored units. Formed in 1943, it was designed to serve as an elite mechanized spearhead, capable of both breakthrough assaults and rapid response operations. Its crews were hand-picked veterans, trained in advanced armored tactics, combined arms warfare, and the precise use of Tiger and Panther tanks. Each element of the division was a carefully orchestrated unit of mechanized might, from tank battalions to mechanized infantry, reconnaissance teams, and artillery support. Visual: Archival photos of Panzer Lehr tanks, crew training, and officers inspecting formations. The division had already earned a reputation for decisive victories in France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. Its success was built on a combination of aggressive doctrine, superior coordination, and technological advantage. But by 1944, cracks were beginning to form. The prolonged war had stretched German logistics to the limit. Fuel shortages, delays in reinforcements, and wear on vehicles began to erode the operational effectiveness of even elite units. Every tank required constant maintenance, every crew needed rest, and yet the demands of continuous combat allowed little respite. Visual: soldiers refueling tanks, repairing tracks, crews checking weapons. Meanwhile, Allied forces were preparing a counter-strategy designed to neutralize Germany's armored superiority. Following the D-Day, they combined intelligence from the French resistance, reconnaissance aircraft, and intercepted communications to anticipate German counterattacks. By analyzing supply routes, terrain, and troop movements, the Allies could predict where and when the panzer divisions would strike, setting traps and fortifying positions accordingly. Visual: Allied command rooms, maps with tank positions and ambush points, reconnaissance photos. The Panzer Lehr Division, despite its elite status, would soon face a battlefield transformed by innovative Allied strategies and overwhelming logistical support. Their primary objective was to launch a counteroffensive that would disrupt the Allied advance, recapture strategic positions, and stabilize the German defensive line. On paper, the division had everything needed to succeed: firepower, mobility, and experience. But in reality, the situation was far more precarious. Visual: maps showing German planned advances, troop movements, and terrain obstacles. One of the greatest challenges was terrain. The division's planned route took them through narrow forested paths, rivers, and open fields, all of which could be exploited by ambushes, artillery, and air strikes. Tanks excel in open, maneuverable spaces where speed and firepower dominate, but dense forests and fortified positions could neutralize their advantages, leaving them vulnerable to precise, coordinated attacks. Visual: drone-like recreation of forested European terrain, tanks navigating narrow paths, artillery positions. Another critical factor was Allied air superiority. By mid-1944, Allied forces had established dominance in the skies. Fighter planes and bombers could track and attack armored columns, while reconnaissance aircraft provided real-time intelligence. Every tank movement was potentially visible from above, every supply convoy could be targeted, and every strategic maneuver could be preemptively countered. Visual: Allied planes flying over European countryside, bombing runs, aerial reconnaissance shots. The Panzer Lehr Division also faced internal challenges. Despite being elite, fatigue and psychological strain were real threats. Soldiers had endured years of intense combat. Tanks had seen countless battles, and maintenance crews struggled to keep them operational under continuous pressure. Commanders had to balance aggressive tactics with careful preservation of men and machines, knowing that a single miscalculation could lead to catastrophic losses. Visual: Soldiers resting in cramped tank interiors, commanders discussing plans, crews repairing vehicles under stress. As the division prepared for its offensive, intelligence reports warned of potential ambushes and prepared Allied defenses along key routes. The division's leadership had to make tough decisions: risk advancing through dangerous terrain to achieve strategic objectives, or delay and risk giving the Allies more time to reinforce positions. Every choice carried high stakes. Visual: Officers analyzing maps with marked danger zones, soldiers readying weapons, artillery shells being loaded. The stage was set for an unprecedented confrontation. The convergence of elite German armor, Allied intelligence, air superiority, and prepared ambushes meant that the coming 96 hours would test every tactical principle the Panzer Lehr Division had ever learned. What was supposed to be a confident, decisive counteroffensive would soon become a desperate struggle for survival. Visual: Simulation of tank columns moving into forests, artillery fire preparing, infantry units advancing under cover. Historical records, war diaries, and survivor accounts reveal the tension and anticipation in the days leading up to the conflict. Officers spoke of meticulous planning, careful coordination, and the confidence that experience had earned them. Yet, even the most detailed preparations could not account for the unrelenting pressure and innovative strategies the Allies would employ. By the time the first shots rang out, the Panzer Lehr Division was already operating at the limits of its endurance. Visual: Soldiers standing by tanks at dawn, commanders pointing at terrain maps, close-ups of anxious faces. The contrast between expectation and reality set the tone for what was to come. Elite tanks moving in confidence would face coordinated ambushes, precise artillery fire, and relentless air attacks. Mechanized infantry, trained to support armored units, would be exposed to new threats they had not encountered before. And commanders, relying on speed and firepower as their greatest weapons, would soon confront the harsh reality of modern combined arms warfare, where intelligence, coordination, and terrain could neutralize even the most formidable division. Visual: Slow motion of tank tracks crushing ground, artillery shells landing nearby, infantry bracing. The Panzer Lehr Division was poised at the edge of disaster. All the elements were in place for a confrontation that would shatter confidence, test human endurance, and redefine armored warfare. The coming 96 hours would reveal not only the power of mechanized might, but also its vulnerabilities, exposing the limits of even the most elite military units. Visual: Panoramic shot of tanks moving into forests, smoke in the distance, tension-filled music. Narrator: slow, reflective pause. In the next chapter, we will dive into the first moments of battle, exploring how strategy collided with reality, and how the Panzer Lehr Division began its descent into a nightmare that would echo through history. Narrator: dramatic, gripping. The first shots of the 96-hour nightmare rang out with deadly precision. The Panzer Lehr Division, elite and battle-hardened, advanced confidently into terrain it believed it could dominate. But the battlefield had been transformed into a trap. Every move was anticipated, every column monitored, and every armored formation carefully targeted. In those first moments, what had been a disciplined offensive became a desperate struggle for survival. Visual: Panzer tanks moving through narrow forested paths, columns twisting and turning, smoke rising from distant artillery fire. The division's tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and their supporting mechanized infantry were symbols of fear and power. They had crushed opposition with relentless force in previous campaigns. Yet here, the division faced a new kind of resistance. Allied forces had positioned anti-tank guns, hidden artillery, and infantry ambushes at key choke points. The very terrain that the Panzer Lehr Division had once used to its advantage now worked against them, forcing tanks into confined spaces and exposing them to deadly fire. Visual: close-ups of anti-tank emplacements hidden among trees, infantry in camouflaged positions, explosions tearing through tank armor. It was chaos from the start. Tank after tank was disabled by precise artillery fire. Columns slowed as crews struggled to maintain coordination under bombardment. Smoke, fire, and debris filled the air. The psychological toll was immediate. Soldiers who had faced countless battles now questioned every command, every maneuver, every decision. Fear, confusion, and exhaustion crept into even the most disciplined units. Visual: soldiers taking cover behind tanks, tank crews frantically repairing damaged equipment, commanders signaling amid smoke. The Allies combined multiple tactics to amplify the division's vulnerability. Aircraft patrolled the skies, dropping bombs with surgical accuracy, while reconnaissance units provided real-time updates on tank positions. Every attempt to regroup was met with coordinated artillery strikes, and every tactical maneuver was anticipated. The Panzer Lehr Division, famed for its adaptability and precision, found itself outmaneuvered at every turn. Visual: Allied bombers releasing ordnance, reconnaissance planes surveying tank columns, artillery rounds striking tanks. The hours passed like a storm. By the end of the first day, the division had already suffered significant losses. Entire battalions were immobilized, armored columns fragmented, and the command structure under tremendous strain. Officers struggled to issue orders through chaotic radio communications, often unaware of the full extent of the damage until reports trickled in. Visual: destroyed tanks smoking in fields, tank crews exiting damaged vehicles, officers consulting maps. The division attempted to counterattack, but the battlefield was now dominated by Allied strategy. Ambushes, flanking maneuvers, and combined arms tactics left no room for the Panzer Lehr's traditional superiority. Even the most seasoned tank crews faced a terrifying reality. The enemy had learned to exploit every strength and weakness of their divisions. What should have been decisive offensives turned into frantic maneuvers just to survive. Visual: tanks firing back, infantry attempting to reclaim ground, close-ups of crew members' anxious expressions. Nightfall offered no respite. The division regrouped, trying to consolidate forces, repair damaged tanks, and maintain cohesion. But the Allies struck again at first light, employing artillery barrages, airstrikes, and infantry harassment to prevent recovery. The Panzer Lehr Division was now trapped in a relentless cycle of attack, retreat, and recovery, with each cycle eroding morale, equipment, and manpower. Visual: nighttime shots of tanks attempting to move under darkness, fires from destroyed vehicles illuminating the battlefield. Within 48 hours, the nightmare escalated. The division's initial confidence was replaced by desperation. Supply lines were compromised, fuel and ammunition dwindled, and communication channels were disrupted by continuous bombardment. Commanders were forced to make impossible decisions, hold their positions and risk annihilation, or retreat and abandon strategically critical areas. Every choice carried the weight of catastrophic consequence. Visual: officers arguing over maps, radio operators relaying urgent messages, soldiers carrying ammunition under fire. By the midpoint of the 96-hour ordeal, the Panzer Lehr Division was no longer a coordinated offensive force. It had become a reactive, fragmented unit, struggling to survive in a battlefield engineered to exploit its vulnerabilities. Anti-tank teams emerged from forests, hidden artillery struck from unexpected angles, and Allied aircraft continued relentless strikes. Tanks that had once symbolized dominance now became metal coffins, vulnerable to every angle of attack. Visual: destroyed tank columns, aerial views of fragmented formations, soldiers seeking cover behind debris. Amid the chaos, heroism emerged. Tank crews repaired damaged armor under fire, infantry units held exposed flanks against overwhelming odds, and commanders improvised daring maneuvers to salvage what remained of their divisions. These moments, though small in the scope of total destruction, highlight the human endurance and bravery that persisted even when defeat seemed inevitable. Visual: slow-motion shots of soldiers emerging from burning tanks, firing, assisting wounded comrades. By the end of 72 hours, the division was facing near total disintegration. Tanks immobilized, infantry scattered, and strategic positions lost. The once feared Panzer Lehr division had become a shadow of its former self. The battlefield, designed to favor the Allies, had exposed every flaw, exploited every weakness, and shattered the myth of German armored invincibility. Yet, even in the face of such devastation, a few pockets of resistance remained. Tanks that could still move, crews that had survived, and commanders who refused to surrender attempted to reorganize and counterattack, showcasing the resilience that had made the division elite in the first place. Every action was a gamble, every maneuver a fight against exhaustion, fear, and overwhelming odds. The first 96 hours, the nightmare, was more than a measure of time, it was a crucible. It revealed the limits of even the most elite forces, the importance of intelligence and coordination, and the terrifying power of a well-prepared enemy. By the end, the Panzer Lehr division had suffered devastating losses, yet its remaining soldiers, battered and exhausted, would carry the story of courage, tragedy, and endurance for years to come. This is where theory meets reality. The Panzer Lehr division, once a symbol of unstoppable German armored power, learned that strategy, terrain, and relentless opposition could defeat even the most feared units in history. In the next chapter, we will explore the twists, surprises, and unexpected turns that pushed this elite division further into catastrophe, reshaping the battlefield forever. Narrator: slow, ominous. By the third day, the Panzer Lehr division believed it had already seen the worst. Tanks burned across the fields. Supply lines lay in ruins. Morale was hanging by a thread. And yet, the true disaster was still coming. Visual: sunrise breaking over a battlefield of smoldering wrecks, smoke drifting through shattered trees. What the surviving German commanders did not yet know was that the Allies had prepared a second, far deadlier trap, one that would collapse what remained of the elite division from the inside out. The battlefield was no longer just a place of combat. It had become an engineered killing zone, built on deception, air dominance, and intelligence warfare at a scale the Germans had never faced before. Visual: Allied intelligence maps overlaying German tank routes, moving arrows, red danger zones. The twist began with a fatal miscalculation. German reconnaissance reported weak Allied resistance ahead. Intercepted radio chatter suggested the enemy was pulling back. The opportunity seemed obvious: a breakthrough. A chance to escape encirclement. A chance to reclaim momentum. Desperate for success, the decision was made to push forward with what remained of the division's operational strength. Visual: German officers over maps, arguing intensely, finally pointing forward. But the intelligence was false. And it had been planted deliberately. Allied forces had intentionally allowed limited movement, leaked controlled radio signals, and staged shallow defensive withdrawals. They wanted the Germans to believe a corridor was open. In reality, that corridor was a narrow, pre-registered artillery tunnel, surrounded by anti-tank positions and forward air controllers. Visual: hidden artillery positions, camouflage nets being lifted, guns slowly elevating. As the battered panzer columns rolled forward at dawn, engines growling through the mist, they crossed an invisible line. And then, the sky ruptured. Sound: sudden massive artillery impact, whistling shells, thunderous explosions. Thousands of artillery shells slammed into the kill zone in minutes. The ground erupted. Trees were shredded into splinters. Tanks were flipped onto their sides like toys. Crews were killed before they could even react. The narrow road became a graveyard of steel and fire. Visual: artillery explosions ripping through tank columns, massive fireballs, shockwaves. Radio operators screamed into dead channels. Commands overlapped in panic. Units became isolated within seconds. Panthers attempted to reverse, only to be hit from the flanks. Tigers rotated their turrets helplessly as bombs crashed down from above. Visual: tank turrets firing wildly, crews scrambling inside, fire engulfing hulls. And then came the aircraft. Allied fighter bombers, waiting silently above the clouds, dove into the chaos in perfectly timed attack waves. Rockets punched through engine decks. Napalm ignited fuel convoys. Strafing runs shredded exposed infantry. Visual: P-47s and Typhoons diving, rockets streaking downward, ground erupting in flames. This was no ordinary battlefield engagement. This was a coordinated annihilation. Within just 4 hours, entire companies of the Panzer Lehr Division ceased to exist. Visual: aerial view of total devastation, blackened earth, burning wrecks scattered endlessly. But the greatest shock, the moment that truly broke the division, came not from fire, but from silence. German commanders soon realized their long-range communications were completely dead. Unknown to them, Allied electronic warfare units had successfully jammed German radio frequencies across the sector. Orders no longer traveled. Intelligence no longer flowed. Units fought blind and deaf. Visual: radio operators pounding broken equipment, static screaming through headphones. Without coordination, even elite forces crumble. Tank battalions advanced into artillery traps without knowing neighboring units had already been destroyed. Infantry advanced without armor support. Medical evacuation collapsed. Ammunition resupply vanished. The Panzer Lehr Division, once the most synchronized armored force in Europe, had been reduced to isolated pockets of survival. Visual: isolated tanks fighting alone, infantry units cut off, wounded soldiers being dragged through mud. Then came another unforeseen blow. The roads themselves became weapons. Allied engineering units sabotaged bridges ahead of retreating German forces while simultaneously mining secondary escape routes. What seemed like open paths turned into death funnels. Panzer battalions attempting withdrawal slammed into collapsed crossings, minefields, and artillery fire waiting on the opposite banks. Visual: bridge collapsing under escaping tanks, mines detonating across roadways. This wasn't just battlefield defeat. This was systematic dismantling. By hour 84 of the nightmare, the Panzer Lehr Division had lost over 70% of its remaining tanks, nearly half of its surviving infantry, and almost all heavy artillery. Even worse, the division's command structure collapsed. Senior officers were killed or cut off. Battalion commanders made life-or-death decisions without strategic guidance. Some units launched suicidal counterattacks simply to break out of encirclement. Others dug defensive positions in shattered villages and fought until ammunition ran dry. One Tiger crew, according to survivor accounts, continued firing for nearly 40 minutes while completely surrounded, burning out of fuel, turret jammed, until Allied infantry finally overran the wreck. When the hatch was opened, all crew members were found dead at their positions. Visual: burned Tiger tank slowly revealed through smoke. This is the moment the myth of Panzer invincibility truly died. The Allies had learned not just how to defeat German armor, but how to erase its ability to function. No heroic charge could overcome total air dominance. No thick armor could stop top-down rocket strikes. No disciplined formation could survive when command itself was shattered. Visual: one lone tank immobilized in an open field as aircraft fly overhead. And yet, even in total collapse, resistance did not completely disappear. Small German groups managed to break through the encirclement under cover of night. Burning vehicles were abandoned. Wounded were carried through forests by hand. Survivors navigated by stars and memory alone, retreating through fields littered with their fallen comrades. Visual: soldiers limping through darkness, carrying wounded, fires burning behind them. The time the 96 hours approached their end, what remained of the Panzer Lehr Division was no longer an armored spearhead. It was a wounded shadow, a shattered symbol. A lesson written in wreckage and fire. Visual. Dawn rising over silent battlefield, smoke slowly lifting. Narrator, quiet, heavy. The nightmare had taken its final shape. Not as one single defeat, but as a chain of perfectly timed disasters. Deception. Jamming. Air power. Engineering sabotage. Psychological collapse. All elements converged into one truth. The most elite division Germany had ever assembled had been systematically dismantled in less than 4 days. And yet, the story does not end here, because what followed would haunt both victors and survivors for years. Music swells slowly with sorrow and tension. Narrator, dramatic transition. In our final chapter, we will witness the aftermath, the cost, and the chilling legacy of the 96-hour nightmare that proved even legends can be broken. Narrator, slow, emotional, reflective. When the 96-hour nightmare finally ended, the battlefield went silent. No engines roared. No shells screamed through the air. No commands echoed through broken radios. Only smoke drifted slowly across the shattered earth, and the wreckage of what was once Germany's most feared armored force lay scattered across the land. Visual. Sunrise over a destroyed battlefield, burned tanks, twisted metal. The Panzer Lehr Division, once the pride of German armored warfare, was gone. Not defeated in a single heroic last stand. Not destroyed by one massive battle, but systematically dismantled, piece by piece, hour by hour, across 4 relentless days of fire, fear, and collapse. Visual. Slow cinematic pan across destroyed Panther and Tiger tanks. Survivors emerged cautiously from ruins, forests, and shell craters. They moved slowly, like shadows of the soldiers they had once been. Faces covered in ash. Uniforms torn. Hands shaking from exhaustion and trauma. Many had not slept in days. Others had not eaten. Some could no longer remember when the last time they felt safe had been. Visual. German soldiers walking through smoke, wounded being supported. They searched for their units. They searched for their officers. They searched for friends who would never answer again. They searched for friends who would never answer again. Roll calls were attempted. Officers called out names into the broken air. One by one, silence answered back. Entire tank crews were gone. Entire companies erased. Entire battalions no longer existed. Visual. Officer holding a list, lowering his head. The truth became undeniable. The Panzer Lehr Division was no longer a fighting force. Its remaining soldiers were pulled from the front line. What was left of its vehicles was either destroyed, abandoned, or captured. The division that had once been built as Germany's ultimate armored weapon was removed from combat, broken beyond repair. Visual. Allied troops inspecting destroyed German armor. Back in Germany, the impact was devastating. There would be no rebuilding this time. No fresh tanks. No trained crews. No fuel to spare. By this point in the war, German industry was under constant Allied bombardment. Factories burned. Rail lines were shattered. Supplies vanished as quickly as they arrived. The destruction of the Panzer Lehr Division was not just a military loss. It was a symbol. A symbol that the era of German armored dominance was over. Visual. Bombed German cities, civilians watching fires in the distance. Where once the Panzer divisions had dominated Europe with speed and terror, now they were hunted from the skies. The Allies had mastered modern warfare, combining air power, intelligence, artillery coordination, and overwhelming production. The battlefield had changed forever, and Germany had fallen behind. Visual. Massive Allied supply convoys rolling through Europe. For the Allied commanders, the destruction of the Panzer Lehr Division confirmed something crucial. German armor could be beaten. German tactics could be predicted. German defenses could be overwhelmed. What happened in those 96 hours became a blueprint for future operations. The tactics of air-ground coordination, electronic interference, deception, and encirclement would be refined and used again, against other units, in other battles, on even larger scales. Visual. War room maps being studied. But for the men who survived inside the Panzer Lehr Division, there were no blueprints for recovering from what they had experienced. Some were captured. Some limped back to German lines. Some never recovered at all. Sound, soft heartbeat mixed with wind. Years later, the survivors would speak of the 96-hour nightmare with haunted voices. They remembered the sky that never went quiet, the explosions that never stopped, the feeling that death was always just seconds away. Many could never sleep without hearing aircraft overhead. Others could never forget the sound of screaming steel. Some never spoke about it at all. Visual: elderly wartime survivor staring silently out a window. The battlefield itself changed over time. Rain washed over the wreckage. Grass rose between broken tracks. Trees grew through shattered holes. Nature slowly reclaimed what war had destroyed. But beneath the soil, the scars remained. Fragments of tanks, shards of armor, and the stories of the men who died there. Visual: abandoned tank wreck covered in vegetation. History would remember the Panzer Division not for how it was formed, but for how it fell. A division built from Germany's best soldiers, equipped with its most powerful tanks, trained in its most advanced tactics. Destroyed in only 4 days, music swells slowly. The 96-hour nightmare proved something that the world would never forget. No armor is too thick. No force is too elite. No legend is too powerful to fall. When intelligence, air power, coordination, and overwhelming industry collide, even the mightiest armies can be erased. Visual: fade from early German victories to late war defeats, yet the story does not truly end on that battlefield. Because what was learned from that destruction reshaped the future of warfare. New tanks were designed. New defenses were built. New doctrines were written. Every modern armored unit today still carries the. Some returned home. Some built families. Some tried to forget. But none of them were ever the same again. Sound: wind growing stronger. The Panzer Division became a warning written in fire and steel. A warning that victory does not belong to courage alone. It belongs to preparation, to intelligence, to adaptation. And to those who fail to adapt, history is merciless. Visual: war cemeteries stretching into the distance. Narrator: low, emotional, final blow. The 96-hour nightmare did not just destroy an elite division. It destroyed the illusion of invincibility.